Hey, what's up, fellow Red Raiders? Brandon Boatright here to elaborate more on my final thesis that we had conducted. Just kind of give you a in-depth review from my perspective, kind of give life to my paper here. This is for the course INTS 4350. My topic of choice was actually something that I collaborated on from my previous integrative studies classes in INTS 3350 and such. But I want to thank Dr. Timothy Parker. Of course, this course has elaborated a lot of things that I haven't really understood before, previously in the past. It's kind of intertwined everything together. But anyways, we'll go ahead and get started. For my particular research, I in my last class that I had to write on human trafficking, which is my topic of choice, I kind of did human trafficking as a broad scale. And this one, my specific title, of course, is Interdisciplinary Research of Human Trafficking and Investigation into the Larger Picture. But this one, I kind of wanted to prioritize human trafficking as it pertains to the United States. What's the prominent causes? What disciplines can be involved? Yada, yada. You know, all the essentials in regards to human trafficking, but in the United States specifically. Topics I'm going to address, of course. I'm going to address the interdisciplinary nature of the topic at hand, the perspectives, the disciplinary perspectives being used, my findings, and of course come up with a conclusion therefore at the end. I'll be bouncing back and forth between, of course, what you see on my screen and my paper here, and I've got the grading rubric right here. Just make sure I hit all the course requirements in full swing. But without further ado, let's get started. So basically, I'll elaborate first on my abstract. I'll just kind of go through my paper and elaborate my findings and my thoughts, and then tie in the nature, the perspectives, and my own words and findings as we go along. Now, first, my abstract basically is just saying that there's so many disciplines involved in this due to the nature that this isn't a complex problem. It cannot be solved by one or even two disciplines. It is a multidisciplinary problem. It is a wicked problem, as we discovered previously in some of our coursework. In regards to human trafficking, whether we're talking about the United States or not, you have to understand psychology viewpoints of the victims that are being taken, even the people conducting the human trafficking incidents. You got to understand how it feels to be human trafficked. You got to try to understand why they're doing this in the first place to any individual. There's so much that goes into it. You can even tap into, as I discussed here in my article a little bit, a lot of findings and a lot of articles I read, peer-reviewed articles, tied border security into human trafficking. Now, I'll go into this more later, but it was hard to discern who was trying to be political and who was actually showing factual evidence that supported the clause that human trafficking in the United States has a real thick correlation with our southern border. But like I said, disciplines I'm going to be mentioning are going to be psychology, political science, criminal justice, and communications. I didn't tie much communications into my essay as I was reviewing it, but communication is key because communication is going to be the Elmer's glue, so have it, that will put all these disciplines together to understand human trafficking as a whole. So when I go to contending thoughts here, this little first page, it was a gentleman named Feingold. He was presenting this paper that said that human trafficking is often hijacked to support policies limiting immigration. Now, the reason I found this important to put in here is because many of these articles, as we learned previously in other INTS classes, is that you have to try to understand the author's bias. So in many of these articles I found, when I was trying to find the correlation between human trafficking and border security, there's a whole lot of bias concerned within that disciplines. Being able to elaborate and find who is just trying to be factual and who is trying to push a political agenda did prove to be troublesome. But this whole first little article here was contending thoughts. This gentleman named Wisner quoted the U.S. Department of State's 2003 Trafficking in Persons report estimated the number of international trafficking victims ranged from 800,000 to 900,000. And you got to keep in mind, this is from the year 2003. We're in 2020 now. So one would assume, this is not factual, this is not quoted, this is personal opinion. one would assume that trafficking cases have only gone up. Now, important to note, as I stated many times before, I saw implicit bias towards trafficking and the correlation between border security no matter which article I read. There was an implicit bias towards the left or the right regarding the border security aspect of human trafficking. The reason I kind of dove into this in my personal article is because I found so many cases of human trafficking according to the U.S. Department of Defense and the U.S. Department of State, showing that many of their cases were tied with the southern border, which, raise the question of how much does the discipline of political science and border security have to actually do with human trafficking? Is there a large correlation? In my findings, I agree. I think yes. Let's just tap in a little bit into some of the political science discipline that would be needed to conduct a thorough investigation of human trafficking. But something interesting to note here, see if you can see it on your screen. Hudlow is an article I read. He wrote this whole article about an idea of advanced security. So essentially, to elaborate more on this, he would have advanced security measures at major sporting events, which is where these are primarily conducted, bars, any isolated place where human trafficking is known to be more than usual. U.S. Department of Defense also noted that a lot of human trafficking incidents actually happen on U.S. highways, particularly in Texas, which is scary. I personally know many people that have had weird occurrences with people following them and such, and in the essence that they might be trafficked. Continue a little bit more down here. We'll tap more into the psychological and sociological disciplines. Like I elaborated a little bit at first, but this is one that interested me the most. Of course, we want to understand the social impact of a victim when they get human trafficked. You can't imagine the amount of cumbersome pain and suffering and just questions that they could potentially have when they're being human trafficking. But something that's even caught my attention further is trying to understand the psychological and sociological disciplines in essence to regards of the capturer, the person that's actually doing the human trafficking. Why are they doing it? What motivates them? More from the National Human Trafficking Hotline. I did a lot of research through them, even spoke with a representative on the phone. They seem to point out the fact that a lot of this revolves around monetary value. So in essence, it's these people that traffic, particularly in the United States or in the world, they almost see individuals as currency or property, particularly women, that they traffic and they bring into these sex trafficking rings, or even more common, I found out, more common in sex trafficking rings, work trafficking rings, where they'll put them into slavery, essentially, to work or perform sexual acts or favors for someone, and they'll receive monetary compensation for it. Tapping more into the law enforcement discipline, one article I found very, very interesting. Jordan defines human trafficking, which is super, I should have started with this, but to understand what human trafficking is the trade of human, most commonly for the purpose of forced labor, sexual slavery, or commercial sexual exploration. That was super interesting to me. So most commonly for the purpose of forced labor. Human trafficking purposes and uses are more prominent in the case of labor, which I found super interesting. More of my findings I didn't include in this paper, but in my past paper I did, there was a lot of trafficking in China specifically for that purpose. In the U.S., we've noticed a lot of cases in regards to our southern border, but there's a whole lot of sex trafficking as well. Something important to note here. So I wrote, Mexico and Middle Eastern countries seem to be the site for the most cases of human trafficking. Mexico seems to be mostly sex trafficking, whereas the Middle East is a mix. It is also important to note that the origin of sex trafficking seems to come from southern parts of Africa, where most of this has originated and is still very prevalent today. Lugo, this was another article I read that I really liked and think pertained to this particular topic. Once again, important to note, though, we always got to keep in mind when we're doing interdisciplinary research, someone's bias. You even got to understand my bias as I'm writing this paper. I'm trying to stay as unbiased as possible and just present facts and information and present articles that I've found. But like I say here, the above article lists no relevance between border security and human trafficking. But gathering upon this insight and empirical data, it is clear to me that the most common of cases of human trafficking is beyond our walls. So it seems like, yes, there is definitely sex trafficking or labor trafficking, human trafficking in the United States, but most of it takes place outside of the United States. It is more of a world problem. Tap more into another discipline, political science. We talked about this a little bit at the first, but we'll dive more into it. This HUD-low monitoring system, I tap more into this again because I think it was a great idea for a monitoring system to try to combat this problem, this wicked problem of human trafficking. And as I mentioned before, it's predominantly young women. They'll do things where they follow them into the bathroom. They follow vehicles. In this particular instance, I noted that this article had pointed out that these international soccer games is a huge, huge opportunity for these criminals to attempt to capture women or even men, anyone, into human trafficking. Continuing more. This little paragraph here talks more about the subject of conflicting disciplines, the ones that seem to conflict. The two disciplines out of the ones we've listed, we've talked about political science, we've talked about law enforcement disciplines, criminal justice, communications, and psychological and sociological disciplines that would all be intertwined with this. But the ones that conflict the most are the ones of the political science nature and law enforcement nature. So law seems to not always gel with political science, and we've seen that, of course, in many aspects of life and policy. But those two disciplines in particular are the ones that conflict the most. Now, as far as putting disciplines together, I once again give another description or definition of trafficking. So the United Nations defines trafficking in persons, or human trafficking, as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by the means or threat of use of force or other forms of coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power, or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments to the benefit to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person. This is from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime 2019, so this is more recent, but it's essentially saying the same thing. These criminals will lure in these young women or young people, and either with persuasion or by force, and force them into labor or sex trafficking. But more on combining these disciplines, something you understand is that if criminal justice and the political science realm could come together and find out exactly what laws and what policies to implement, those political scientists or government officials could implement those laws, and then of course law enforcement could execute those laws. I even go into Repco's process here. Step 4 of Repco's process was the one that I found most prevalent in my research article, but Step 4 of Repco's approach is the guiding principle behind the text. The compiled empirical data of case after case presented by the National Human Trafficking Hotline proves that this is a serious problem throughout the world and in the United States particularly. The psychological approach would be from the junction to try and seek and understand why these people do what they do. Is it only for profit? I ask that question as a question that, regarding most articles, that's the conclusion that I would come to, is that it seems that the main reason for human trafficking is monetary value. Continuing on here. Wrapping up the discussion, I could talk about this for hours, but in conclusion, it became more and more evident that human trafficking is clearly a wicked problem, as I originally stated. The combination of psychological, law enforcement, political science disciplines, and of course communication, I didn't put that in here, but looking back in retrospect, I definitely should have. The biggest struggle would be eliminating bias out of the political science discipline. As an interdisciplinarian, we would have to consider and evaluate all biases presented by other scholars when determining a solution to this problem. So it's so diverse and so wicked that there's so many elements of other disciplines and articles and things that can be intertwined to this. This one in particular for the United States, border security was huge in the essence of human trafficking. Another little state here. There has been years and years of research conducted on the matter, and many large human trafficking rings have already been busted by law enforcement and border security agents. This was research conducted from National Human Trafficking Hotline 2018. No matter, one human trafficking case is one too many. We reviewed the many disciplines it would take to apprehend such a robust, worldly organization, but narrowed our attention specifically to the U.S., which led through research and hard prevalence with the southern border. Like I said, there were so many articles throughout my paper that showed a correlation between human trafficking in the United States and our southern border, which would bring up the agenda or the potential of maybe heightening border security. But that's, again, that's a hard thing to keep in mind, is you got to keep border security when you bring that into the realm. There's a bunch of bias one way or the other in regards to an interdisciplinary research. I believe there's a social responsibility we all share in being able to identify key signs of one that is currently being trafficked. That would be communication, marketing. There's so many disciplines that could be tied in, more to what I listed here in my article. Being able to show signs of human trafficking, and for us as individuals to understand those signs. Signs that in a local neighborhood or highway that there is a human trafficking organization being ran. Similar, I think something similar to how, if there's a sex offender nearby, it notifies you. I think it should be the same media outlet when there's a human trafficking ring or suspicion of human trafficking within the area. I put here, America is simply not educated enough on the matter at hand. Being able to educate the population, understand that true psychological reasoning behind trafficking, law enforcement agencies and border patrol agencies being able to have the clearance to apprehend potential human trafficking leaders and government officials backing these acts would be a few of the many needed aspects into potentially ever ending a wicked problem such as human trafficking. So, in conclusion, political science, law enforcement agencies, psychological, sociological elements, and communication would be key. When I mentioned that communication would be the glue, essentially, of all this, all of these disciplines would have to be able to communicate and work together in order to find a solution to this wicked problem. And according to my research and findings, of course, implementing higher security, implementing more public knowledge on the issue at hand, identifying hotspots and potential trafficking rings would be just some of the few steps that we could start to take to try to eliminate this problem. Like I say here, through interdisciplinary research, I believe several of these key takeaways I gathered would be a good place to start. That's pretty much just a sum up of my paper. There's a whole bunch of information in here if you guys want to go back and read it. I just kind of highlighted the key points and everything. But again, thanks for a great semester, guys. It was a pleasure working with you guys. I loved reading your discussion posts. Dr. Parker, of course, had some great insight and feedback for all of us. And I wish you all the best. And thank you for watching my video.